Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 7th talk in the FY NOAA's Environmental Leadership Seminar Series. The goal of these seminars is to showcase NOAA's leadership in environmental science by those who lead it and make it happen. My name is Tracy Gill, and I am with NOAA's National Ocean Service. One moment. Okay, great. I would like to thank the NOAA Research Council who sponsors the NELS webinar series, as well as the NELS team I work with in producing these seminars. Hernan Garcia with NOAA's National Environmental Satellite Data and Information Service, or NESDIS, Sandra Clare, also with NESDIS, and Katie Rowley with the NOAA Central Library. Other NOAA staff join us each month to make these NOAA leadership webinars possible. Today, we'd like to thank Will Claybor, a 2021 Knaus Fellow working with NOAA's National Marine Fisheries Service and National Ocean Service. Will be moderating the questions and comments today. And last but not least, thanks to the captioner for making these webinars more accessible. Here are a few webinar logistics, and you can also find them listed in the Q&A pod. All attendees are muted. Adobe Connect attendees may post their questions and comments into the Q&A pod at any time, and we will get to as many as you can. If you have technical issues with Adobe Connect, send a note to the Q&A pod or email tracy.gill@noaa.gov. If you need a phone option for audio, email tracy.gill@noaa.gov. If your system seems to be lagging, turn off any extra apps you might have on. And you can visit the NOAA Environmental Leadership Seminar Series webpage at the link listed in the Q&A pod. There you can find links to past recordings and PDFs. And so today's seminar is titled 10 Ocean Prophecies, and our speaker is Dr. Jason Link, Senior Scientist for Ecosystem at NOAA's National Marine Fisheries Service, and here is a little more information on him. Dr. Jason Link earned his BS in biology with a minor in chemistry from Central Michigan University. He then received his PhD from Michigan Technological University. He began his career with NOAA NIMFs at the Pascagoula Lab before moving to the Woods Hole Lab. In his current role, Dr. Link leads approaches and models to support development of ecosystem-based management plans and activities throughout the agency, serving as the agency's senior-most authority on ecosystem science. Dr. Link has written several books and book chapters on the topic of ecosystem-based fisheries management, has written over 200 peer-reviewed publications, over 300 reports, has over 250 published abstracts, and has convened over 10 major international symposia and summits on marine ecosystem management and modeling related topics. Dr. Link has championed ecosystem science and ecosystem-based management for resource management agencies in the US and around the world, sitting on several international advisory or executive boards and the editorial board of an international marine science journal. Dr. Link holds an adjunct faculty position at the School for Marine Science and Technology at the University of Massachusetts, is a fellow of the American Institute of Fishery Research Biologists, holds an executive leadership certificate from the Harvard Kennedy School, and has received a Department of Commerce Bronze Medal and the Fisheries Society of the British Isles Medal for significant advances in fisheries science. Welcome, Dr. Link. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Tracy. I really appreciate that kind introduction. Let me first not only thank you, Tracy, but Hernan, Sandra, and Katie for the invitation to present to all of you all on the call today. And I also want to thank you for the excellent job that you do in producing this environmental leadership series. I also want to thank Will Claybor, who is a new member of the Knaus Mafia, which we all know runs our agency. So if I'm not allowed to say that, let me just say, Will is a newly minted Knaus Fellow, and he, as Tracy said, he'll be helping us with the chat box and the Q&A that will appear later. I also want to thank all my colleagues, many of you on this seminar, who have helped shape my thoughts and thinking on this topic, and especially the NIMF Science Board. So as Tracy said, I am Jason Link. I'm the Senior Scientist, or ST, for Ecosystems at NOAA Fisheries. I'm one of about 20 or so STs and SLs in all of NOAA. Us STs and SLs form the Council of NOAA Fellows, which is kind of like Jedi Knights making up the Star Wars Jedi Council, but we don't have the cool lightsabers. So anyways, we serve in various line offices. We have different topical areas of emphasis. And as the NOAA Fisheries Ecosystem ST, basically the ecosystem guy within NOAA, I particularly have a systems view of the world, looking at integration of information and multidisciplinary considerations. The other thing in my role is I take very seriously the need to champion the multiple disciplines and multiple missions we have across NOAA that relate to marine ecosystems. So from that vantage point, I get to step back, observe, and piece together a lot of information. What I want to present to you today is a synthesis of all of these things that I'm observing. I want to provide a synthesis of sorts of not only what we observe and predict, but I want to try to attempt to tie them together into a string of possible effects brought about by changes to the ocean that we see, and how that is systematically impacting all of us. But more than that, I want to call an action. I want to provide a call to action. I want to note some major changes that we're facing, and I want to challenge perhaps some of the major ways that we do business. So by the way, the organizers wanted a picture of me so you could see what I look like. So here's one picture. Here's the main thought of my talk. We're facing unprecedented changes and a remarkable rate of change to the ocean, and these have implications to the stuff we all care about. Time won't permit me to list all the challenges, changes, issues, and impacts that are facing us. Let me just say that the ocean is changing in so many ways, often beyond anything we have ever observed before. And these changes are occurring at rates much, much faster than anything we've predicted. In fact, many of the changes have far outpaced the timing of our predictions and forecasts. More so, all these changes have major ramifications for the many marine ecosystem goods and services that comprise the bulk of our mission. I trust that you fully grasp and are at least mildly alarmed by the magnitude and pace of changes facing us. So herein today, I'll try to give you examples of why this matters. I'll try to synthesize a lot of information into what are hopefully digestible chunks. And I'll also try to make some predictions of what we can expect without major mitigation or adaptations. Finally, I'll try to suggest potential areas where we could activate attention to perhaps address some of these challenges, with the aim, again, for a hopeful call to action. If you hear nothing else today, hear this. What we do matters. The stakes ultimately impact American lives, and it is up to us to find solutions that bring hope. Here are some take-home messages. We are facing unprecedented and severe, impactful, amazing changes, and I'll give you a few examples of these. We know enough to act. And I'm not by any means anti-science or anti-data, but often we fall back on the line of we need more data, we need more study, we need more research. We can't keep doing that. Instead, we need to address the challenges I'm going to present to you, even with all their uncertainties, as best as we can now. And I would argue, and I hope you will agree, and I hope you'll see this, we can most effectively do so by pulling together, both as a one NOAA community and as an ocean-oriented multiple set of disciplines working together. Before I get into all of that, let me give you perhaps a little bit of context. This talk has 10 Ocean Prophecies as its title. That probably got your attention, but seriously, I mean, prophecy, really, what is this guy talking about? You're probably going, is he crazy? I thought this was a science talk. Let me just say this. Society has always had individuals set aside to point out cold, hard truths, even if unpopular, and use those truths to predict the future and effect necessary change. By prophet here in our context, I mean someone who will do just that. Today, we call them scientists, a lot of you all. And by the way, that is not a picture of me. Again, society has always had individuals set aside to point out difficult things. You can see on the left what we used to call scientists were prophets, oracles, magi, wizards, Gandalf, economists, etc. And on the right, we had those who were maintaining the system compared to those on the left who were trying to shock and change the system. There's an inherent tension, and that's represented by the tug of war on the bottom, between those disrupting or challenging the system and those trying to maintain it. So over time, we've got all kinds of changes in roles and titles, but I think this inherent tension remains. And as you can see, the balance between the two is challenging. It's always a difficult proposition to find the right balance between change and disruption versus maintaining the system. I get it. We need both, but I think this is something we need to pay attention to in a government organization. And the reason I'm flagging this is, quote, prophecies, if handled and acted upon correctly, help us shift into new conditions and help us effect change and minimize the shock and disruption. Prophecies, or in our vernacular, predictions, if handled incorrectly, can often result in new catastrophes, many of which were avoidable. So the question I pose to myself and I pose to you all, have we lost our way by being, quote, non-prophetic? Have we lost our voice by being so focused on programs and projects and budgets and so forth? And have we lost sight of the science we need to conduct to address these challenges? These are some key questions to ponder as we walk through the 10 prophecies I'm going to talk to you about in the following moments. One other note before we start, every, quote, prophecy or prediction that I'm going to show you herein has literature and data to back it up. I want to be clear on that. I'm not going to get into the details, but these are verifiable situations and available information. So let's take a look at the first one. This is coastal Maine. It has all the usual iconic images, lighthouses, craggy, rocky coastlines, cod, and lobster, which is the phonetically correct pronunciation of lobster. And I highlight this to you for a couple reasons. Pretty much northeast of Rockland and Stonington, Port Clyde, there's hardly any fishing anymore. And Portland, down south in Maine, used to be a major fishing port, and that's declined as well. The fleet has been edged out of the groundfish fishery and began emphasizing northern shrimp. We saw a shift in predators. We saw a change in temperature. We had lots of retrospective problems in the modeling, such that there was a recruitment failure. And you can see that here at the end of the time series. Such that in 2014, we had a moratorium on shrimp fishing. And that went through 2018. Well, guess what? In 2018, it was extended to 2021. So nationally, when we hear a story like this, we tend to write it off. It's a fairly small value fishery, only about $5 million. It doesn't impact major ports or populations, and it may or may not impact a keystone species in the ecosystem. But try telling that to all the people in Port Clyde, Maine. Plus, we thought this might be a sign of things to come. I had flagged this in a talk in 2015, saying that there could be challenges ahead for another major decapod fishery in the Gulf of Maine. So let's continue. Of the many climate-induced shifts to distribution, among the many, many examples and measures I could show, let me point out to you just one today. It's this concept of climate velocity. Climate velocity is the rate at which oceanic waters are changing and shifting major water masses and their thermal content. Basically, you can have the marine temperature of whatever degree shifting however far per unit time. That's the idea. And marine species follow these water mass shifts such that climate velocity has been applied to their shifts in distribution. And you can see a couple summary statistics at the top here. Marine species are moving on average about 40 miles per decade. Just to give you context, that's 6 times faster than any distribution shifts we see on land. And marine species are moving to deeper waters at about 10 meters per decade. So recall from when you've been snorkeling or scuba diving that is a change of about 1 atmosphere of pressure with associated physiological impacts. The ramifications are that we've already seen cross-jurisdictional challenges for tilefish, for example, from the South and Mid-Atlantic Councils. But what about for a major culturally dominant species? And that begs a question. We've got maybe about 5 to 8 years left before Atlantic cod is essentially Canadian with only vestigial remnants in U.S. waters. There have been arguments in the literature over the details of whether, for example, 4-year-old cod have a certain level of mortality in this situation. There's a lot of debate, I get it. But focusing on such minutia doesn't always help and misses the bigger point. Even if it's 10 or 15 years from now, and even if not all ages of cod will move out of this region, the vast majority will lower their productivity. And that gets my attention. Here's another example. We've got about 10 to 15 years before a $500 million industry, a $500 million fishery, actually now over $650 million, the American lobster, becomes mostly Canadian. Remember when we flagged the loss of a smaller scale shrimp fishery, which is another decapod in the region? This is that on steroids. We still don't seem to grasp the pace and consequences of these shifts. There have been heated arguments over the details of how long this shift will take. Those often don't always help. I get you need to get the details, but there are major changes facing us. And apologies for those of you in the Northeast, but by the end of your careers, you could see the loss of at least one, if not more, American icons. And this isn't just in one region either. Let's look at a major volume fishery, the Pacific hake on the West Coast. We've got a wide range of uncertainty, largely dependent upon climate phenomena and where major North Pacific current intercepts the continent, the Trans-Pacific current. But by a lot of projections, and again, there's wiggle and waggle in that current, but we have maybe around 20 years before the bulk of this species is majority Canadian. And arguably, our most important fishery in the nation, walleye pollock, in terms of volume and value, is becoming more Arctic every year, especially with the retreat of sea ice. As such, the costs to catch this fish are increasing. I mean, imagine having to travel to work an extra 4 or 5 miles every day, which would increase each and every year. That would cost you. And I think it's going to cost the fishery there. The challenges of this species hitting international waters, if and when it moves beyond our EEZ, are not going to be trivial. There are many opportunities, and certainly there might be some silver linings to this from the tropicalization of temperate and more northern waters as these stocks move and replace some of the stocks that are moving out. That's probably part of the story. But in many cases, fish are moving out of an ecosystem. And with the fish being gone, that has loss of infrastructure and will certainly multiply the impacts on local economies. I wanted to focus on this example to highlight a few challenges and solutions, and that we need to move past the debates that these shifts are actually happening and start mitigating or adapting to them. So here's my first prophecy. We will have major fisheries move out of U.S. jurisdiction within the next 15 to 20 years. And I think the probability of that occurring in that time frame is about 9 out of 10. So that begs the question, what do we do about this? What are some possible solutions? Well, I think the first thing is to just say, we recognize this is happening. Maybe plan for it. Maybe we can incorporate this into analyses as best we can. But I would say even more so, let's account for this and provide options under these conditions, particularly in our governance choices, which might mean we need to allow for more regulatory flexibility and particularly identify the on-ramps for all the science swirling about that comes from the models that are detecting all these distribution shifts. And maybe we need to manage, given the fact that some species are moving in and some moving out, manage all the fisheries in a region as a portfolio. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So is there science we can do? Sure. And sure, the usual population and spatial and distribution modeling is appropriate. But more so, I think the science of decision making under extreme conditions and high uncertainty is pretty critical. And the sweet spot we need are predictions or forecasts in the 3 to 10 year range, which seems to be overlooked in kind of that weather to seasonal forecast scale, time scale, and decadal to century scales. Finally, there's scenario evaluations, there's scenario planning, strategy planning, and so forth that are very, very appropriate here. So let's look at another related example. In the tropics, there are challenges. Fish are smaller, there is less biomass, there is less catch, CPU is going down, effort is increasing. We see that here in this cartoon picture. We see a depletion of stock after stock. This is a sequential depletion scenario. And fisheries are traveling further from ports. Catches in the tropics are strained. And ecosystem overfishing is occurring in most of the tropics. So you consider that at the same time, the demand for fish in the tropics has increased, but the fish themselves are moving towards the poles. This represents kind of a double whammy for those in the tropical region. In other words, fisheries are traveling further from ports, both longitudinally and also latitudinally, and their access to higher latitudes poses challenges for major EEZ or border conflicts. There's no significant shift in the poleward movement of tropical fleets for several reasons. So the ramifications of this tropical crunch really are for food security and cultural identity. They're very acute, and it's impacting a lot of the world in this tropical band. The economic and governance ramifications are also not trivial. But again, I return to the food security issues from this tropical crunch, where you have tropical pressure of the fisheries and a polar shift of the fish results in this tropical crunch. Over 20% of the world's protein consumption comes from fish, and much of that occurs in this region of the world, which leads to national security issues. There have already been erosion of respect for EEZs. For example, conflicts in the South China Sea are quite routine. There have even been minor armed conflicts over fisheries access. Multiple human populations could also be facing severe food security issues. The intelligence community is paying attention to this as well. So here's my prophecy or prediction, that there will be a significant conflict, perhaps even armed, in the tropics over fisheries resource or access thereto, and the probability of occurring is probably on the order of 7 out of 10. So what do we do? What are some possible solutions? Again, let's recognize it's happening. I think besides the moral imperative, we need to explore some diplomacy and aid in the interest of our own national security. I think the expanded role of other means of protein, like aquaculture and other things, is worth exploring. We probably ought to explore jurisdictional and spatial management options, develop and bolster resource negotiations now, and particularly deal with IUU and other overfishing practices. So is there science needed? Well, of course. The usual fisheries and spatial and distribution modeling also applies. And I think if we started to monitor and report on measures of ecosystem overfishing, that actually might help us get ahead of this issue, as well as the usual scenario planning and so forth. So that's the example from the tropics. Let's move to the Arctic. This is a striking satellite image of the North Pole, the Arctic Ocean. On it is the current ice sheet extent, and superimposed at what it once was in the yellow line there. And you can see the Arctic ice sheet is melting. This ice coverage is shrinking much faster than predicted by at least about a decade or so sooner than forecasts. Predictions are that the Arctic will have ice-free summers by around the end of this decade. So some basic geography here. In case you forgot, unlike Antarctica, the Arctic has no landmass for the North Pole region. This has implications for high seas access, jurisdiction, and utilization of resources. An ice-free open Arctic Ocean provides easier shipping opportunities, and with it the potential for major environmental disasters due to increased vessel traffic in what is still a very harsh environment. An ice-free open Arctic also provides access to marine resources beyond the EEZs of the Arctic bordering nations. Who owns and who has access to what part of the high seas Arctic? An important question. There are national security issues from this situation. The potential for conflict over resources is not nil. Non-Arctic nations have expressed interest in Arctic treaty discussions, especially high seas resources outside of EEZs. The intelligence community is paying attention to this, as is the defense community and major multinational corporations, especially those in the energy sector, are very much so paying attention to this as well. So here's my prophecy or prediction, is that the Arctic will be ice-free in summer within 10 to 15 years, and that either a major environmental disaster and or a major international conflict over resources will occur. And the probability of that occurring is maybe about 6 out of 10. So what do we do? What are some possible solutions? Again, recognize it is happening. We're unlikely to perhaps mitigate it at this point, but we can certainly adapt to it. And maybe some involvement in Arctic Council and proactively discussing these conflicts and resource negotiations is warranted. I would also say perhaps we could apply lessons learned from CAMLAR in the Antarctic and evaluate our areas beyond national jurisdiction involvement. And of course, there are certainly science things we can do, the usual continued ice monitoring and modeling, and detailed predictions of when and where the ice-free conditions will occur. But I would also argue we probably need to think about baseline resource monitoring, or at least beginning that, especially in the Chukchi and Beaufort Seas. So those are some examples kind of internationally. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about harmful algal blooms. The prevalence of harmful algal blooms, red tides, and similarly undesirable phytoplankton has increased. These HABs are projected to increase. They are due to increased temperatures, increased nutrients or eutrophication, deoxygenation, and related factors. And beyond that, due to increased nutrient loading, climate change, increased coastal population, and even development that impacts water flow in near coastal areas. It is not trivial that ocean production is shifting to nasty stuff. These nasty HABs have major impacts on coastal communities. For example, the impacts of these harmful algal blooms have and will continue to result in things such as fish kills that you can see here, beach closures, loss of tourism, all with economic impacts. In some locations, these HABs are impacting water quality in ways that will take a very long time to recover. There's even concern that some of these HABs are hampering human health with an increase in aerosolized toxins in some coastal areas. There have even been some suspected fatalities due to HABs. Now, certainly, some regions have really made progress on dealing with HABs and the underlying conditions in eutrophication that can cause them. Here's my prophecy or prediction, that harmful algal blooms will continue to increase with loss of water quality and an increase in toxin loads, resulting in a major health crisis in a large coastal population. The probability of that occurring may be 4 out of 10. So again, what can we do about that? Are there possible solutions? I think the first thing is to recognize it is happening. and bolster plans to reduce nutrient loads, deal with eutrophication and watershed issues that lead to conditions amenable to HABs. We might also want to reevaluate coastal construction practices and explore even human behaviors to better heed and respond to some of the warnings that are put out there. Sure, we have science needs and need to continue HAB forecasts and modeling and more rigorous predictions of where those will occur, but also research into scenarios to mitigate the factors causing HABs, and particularly cost-benefit analyses to see which measures will be most effective. And again, like all of these, I suspect there's a role for management strategy evaluation, scenario planning, and so forth. The global ocean's primary production is about 40 to 50 gigatons per carbon per year. That's 40 to 50 gigatons of carbon per year. That is 10 to the ninth, or 40 to 50 billion tons. Plus, I got to say giga in a sentence. This production is not projected to change too much, maybe declining up to around 10%. But when and where that production occurs is projected to change. This has implications for how many living marine resources can be produced in a given ecosystem. And you see that here with the food web, the trophic pyramid. The challenge with that is we're not going to produce more fish than what any given ocean ecosystem can support. And this graphic shows why some regions have more productive and hence lucrative fisheries. And that is because of the inherent properties of these different ecosystems. Based upon levels of primary production, these are real production constraints. The reason this is important is because all the changes to the ocean we've been discussing will impact primary production and ultimately how much productivity we'll have in our fisheries. The amount of fish in any given part of the ocean is changing, and translating these into economics, primary production ultimately constrains the revenue that we can obtain from any given marine ecosystem. Now, at scale, the scale of these large marine ecosystems, we simply cannot add sufficiently enough base materials to create more fish. This is an ecological law and a law of thermodynamics. We're not going to expand the LMR-based blue economy beyond what a given ocean ecosystem can support. And because of this limit to production, ultimately, ocean primary production limits will result in cage matches. And given the ultimate constraints on production in an ecosystem and all the dynamics of these socio-ecological systems, it has become even more clear that there are going to be increasing competing agendas as we manage our living marine resources. And these different agendas, different objectives, and so forth are in conflict. Ignoring these conflicting objectives does not make them go away. These trade-offs are why we need to do ecosystem-based fisheries management. We're not going to manage our way out of complex situations that have legitimate trade-offs via one stock at a time that single species assessments we do were not set up to handle. And there's no way that a species by species by species focus can address these conflicts across all of our trust species and those interested in them. So here are some examples of cage matches. You have protected resources on protected resources. You wonder if there's enough food for certain protected resources. There's fish versus protected resources. There's fish versus other fish, etc., etc. Ignoring these trade-offs and the production constraints that cause these trade-offs is going to cause problems. So here's my prophecy or prediction, that ocean production constraints will sharpen such that major stakeholders will have significant conflicts about a cage match type of situation that will result in increased lawsuits and loss of fishery yield. The probability of this occurring in the next 10 to 15 years is probably 7 out of 10. Some of my colleagues advise me that that's probably even more probable and should be higher, but 70% option is probably where we're at least right at this moment. So what do we do about it? What are some possible solutions? Again, recognize that it's happening. Manage fisheries in a region as a portfolio, not on a species by species basis that ignores that they're interacting taxa. I think we need to look at our governance structures and bodies and see how we can help them deal with trade-offs, and maybe even broaden the performance metrics of ecosystem goods and services and living marine resource management outcomes for a given ecosystem. Sure, we need to do our science, the usual data streams and assessment models. I'm not saying we don't need to do that, but perhaps we need to increase the development and use of multi-species or ecosystem models. And I would argue develop economic analyses, especially portfolio analyses, to quantitatively address these trade-offs. Okay, shifting gears yet again, here's another one. The number of hurricanes is already increasing. The length of the hurricane season is already increasing. The intensity of hurricanes are also increasing. All Earth system models project conditions that will only see a continuation of these increases, if not an escalation thereof. So layer on top of that this consideration. Coastal populations everywhere are increasing. Coastal development and real estate has increased. Now, obviously, the impacts of hurricanes are severe in terms of property damage, loss of infrastructure, even loss of life, sadly. The insurance industry, especially the larger reinsurance industry, is definitely paying attention to this issue. So here's a prophecy or prediction, is that a major megalopolis or metropolitan area will be struck by a hurricane within the next 20 years or so. The probability of that occurring in that time frame is maybe 50-50, 5 out of 10. So what can we do about that? What are some possible solutions? Well, I think we need to recognize it is happening. I think we need to plan for it and know we really can't mitigate it or change it at scale, but perhaps we can adapt to it and build in resilience. And that probably includes revising coastal planning policies and revisiting infrastructure needs. Certainly there's science we need, such as continuing hurricane monitoring and modeling. In addition to that, economic impact modeling, and I would say risk assessments for updated hurricane and flood zones and maps and associated documents. And then there's human dimension research to continue to explore options for helping adapt behavior. So that was hurricanes. Let me show you something that's perhaps a little closer to home for me. This is the boardwalk in my town. It is 8.3 miles from my house. It is infamous and very closely associated with my town to the point that it is a destination unto itself. A lot of rites of passage for kids in town occur here. Everyone has to jump off the bridge at least once during their childhood summers. The boardwalk has memorials and names and a rich local cultural heritage engraved on nearly every plank. It is an important part of our town, attracting tourists, kayak renters, beachgoers, snow cone eaters, and the usual activity of beautiful summer days. Just last month, this is what happened. The boardwalk is in rough shape. Serious and heated debates are occurring about whether to repair or replace the boardwalk, and if so, what it should be like. This is an example of the challenges facing coastal communities due to sea level rise. This is 5.9 miles from my house. Less than a month ago, this is what happened. Now, certainly there were many factors impacting the boardwalk and these beachfront homes, but it is obvious that sea level rise is already having an impact. Again, this example is close to home for me, but I'm aware of many other places. I think of Miami or Portland, Maine, or New Orleans or Newport News, Virginia, and so many other places are already experiencing significant flooding. The sea level is projected to rise. That is not in doubt. What is less certain is by how much, and sometimes just arguing over this instead of finding solutions doesn't always help. The implications for real estate and coastal communities and economies are not trivial. Much infrastructure needs to be rethought, and associated projections have notable portions of the human population, perhaps even migrating away from coasts. So here's my prophecy or prediction that a major megalopolis or metropolitan area will be inundated to the point of losing significant infrastructure value and population. The probability of this occurring in the next 10 to 20 years is on the order of 8 out of 10. So again, what can we do? Are there possible solutions? I think we need to recognize it as happening. I think we can plan for it and know we might not at this point be able to mitigate it, but we can certainly adapt to it and build in resilience. And I think this affords an opportunity to revise coastal planning policies and revisit infrastructure needs. Sure, we need to continue to do science, the usual continued sea level monitoring and modeling and detailed predictions of when and where that will occur, but also economic modeling and risk assessments for new flood zones and the human dimensions to explore options for adapting, as well as the usual scenario planning. Here's a related example. Over 1/4 of the countries on the planet are island nation states. There are another 45 associated island protectorates and territories. Over 125 million people live in these island nation states. Many of them are small in terms of area, population, economic impact, but many are large in terms of strategic importance and the number of indigenous cultures. Many are located in the tropics and have some of the subsistence challenges that I noted earlier. Sea level rise is also impacting these island nation states. Not typically what we think of from a movie when a massive wave overruns the island, although we did just have a tsunami scare last week in the Pacific, but more so with saltwater incursions into freshwater aquifers, salinization of croplands, loss of agriculture, loss of fringing reefs, and similar less obvious but no less catastrophic means of impact than, say, a big wave. There are already a few island nation states from the South Pacific that have had to relocate their population, which was essentially enforced due to loss of freshwater, and does not count voluntary preemptive population migrations out of these island nations. In the process, we lose not only island nation states, but their unique cultures, their identities, and their ways of life. My prophecy or prediction is that at least one more island nation state will need to relocate their population with attendant loss of nationhood and culture due to saltwater intrusion. And the probability of this occurring is on the order of 7 out of 10 within the next 15 to 25 years. So what do we do? What are some possible solutions? Recognize it is happening, plan for it, and know we might not be able to change it at this point, but adapt to it. Seek some multilateral solutions and plan ahead to deal with what might become, quote, climate refugees. And I think, again, besides the moral imperative, we might want to explore diplomacy and aid in the interests of our own national security. Sure, the usual sea level modeling and monitoring that I just talked about applies here, but the human dimension studies to predict population migrations, human dimension studies to explore options for adapting are all very much important. There are a lot of ocean uses. I hope you've seen that and hope you're looking at that as well. There are a lot of marine ecosystem goods and services. Often those who seek to utilize the ocean, its resources, or its products are in conflict with those who seek different ocean uses. So by ignoring these trade-offs, we miss opportunities. Ignoring trade-offs has resulted in lost opportunities, less stability, more risk, foregone revenue. Plus, ignoring the trade-offs does not mean that they don't exist and does not mean that they go away. Given this, we need to operationally adopt and implement ecosystem-based management across all ocean use sectors, which seeks to address all these trade-offs in a systematic and logical manner. But we really haven't done that yet, and it is costing us. As an example, let's look at an example of all the fisheries in just one ecosystem. We can calculate the portfolio frontier for such a coupled socio-ecological system and using readily available data today. This closer one is a frontier, and it's the higher economic return relative to risk. So the closer one gets to a frontier, say like here, you have higher returns with the same amount of risk that you see down here. Or you have higher risk for the same amount of return, or depending upon how you're handling this. So for example, when we calculate an ecosystem frontier that accounts for all these changes, which is the blue line over here, that dominates the single species frontier, the red line here. And the reason is because the single species frontier ignores the covariance that exists between species. In other words, the trade-offs among them. So the same expected return can be had with lower risk if you compare the green examples, or the same risk, you can get a higher return. And the actual data that we have and that we see are far from either the single species or the ecosystem frontier. Now, I highlight this to you to show or emphasize that not one of us places their retirement funds in any one stock. We don't do just one stock. We have a blend of investment options, such as portfolios that are managed to balance risk, return, stability, and related factors. And yet we do not manage for a portfolio of stocks in marine fisheries or for marine ecosystems and their uses. Instead, we manage as if the issues are not interconnected, do not co-vary, and do not impact one another. I personally think that needs to stop, but I also recognize that stopping is hard to do. In this case, in several places around the country, several progressive fish processors have shifted to this as their business model by adopting this broader portfolio approach. But a lot of the structures and protocols we have hamper such approaches. In the few cases where management has adopted these approaches, the results are categorically positive. When we're not doing this, I think we're leaving money on the table by not dealing with these trade-offs. And this is true across multiple sectors beyond just fisheries. So here's my prophecy or prediction. We will continue to lose anywhere from $1.5 to $2 billion as a nation due to lack of coordination across ocean use sectors. The probability of that occurring in the next 5 to 10 years, 9 out of 10. And I could almost argue maybe 10 out of 10. And the reason I am so confident in this prediction is, well, because we already have. And though we've pushed for ecosystem-based management, we're a long ways from actually implementing it. So what do? Again, recognize this is happening, change our emphasis and organizational performance metrics to account for the portfolio considerations. And I think we need to fully agree to adopt EBM and lead other federal agencies in doing so. To be fair, we've started on EBM, and we've done a really good start in ecosystem-based fisheries management in the fisheries sector, but we need to continue. And I think revisiting the multi-sector governance institutions is one of the challenges we need to begin to address this. And dealing with trade-offs across sectors is going to be key. So we could use more of the portfolio analyses and bioeconomic modeling that I've alluded to, and particularly formal trade-off analyses. And I think showcasing and reporting on ecological, environmental, economic, and social aspects of a trade-offs, such that they become routine, is something that we can do. An example will be given to you at the end of this talk, the recent National Marine Ecosystem Status website. There'll be a link there at the end of this session. You can look at that. And so we're starting to do this, but we could use more. And again, we could talk more about scenario planning, management strategy evaluations, and so on and so forth. So let me begin to wrap up. That was 9 prophecies. You can see them listed here, and we haven't even mentioned other possible impacts. For example, marine heat waves that'll keep coming, or major ocean currents that are changing and seem to be in the news a lot lately, or carbonate-based systems like reefs or other things, oyster shoals. Those services are eroding. Hypoxic zones are increasing. Other more powerful ocean use industries are growing, etc., etc. And I need to apologize now that I probably missed some of the things that perhaps some of you are very interested in, and I apologize for that. But what I want to do is end on a more hopeful note. A lot of the issues I raised today are what are called adaptive challenges. Adaptive challenges aren't always amenable to technical solutions. This often poses consternation to our scientific way of thinking and really highlights the need for adaptive thinking and leadership by all of us. Now, sure, there were some common challenges across the predictions or prophecies I noted for you. These include the many serious and severe challenges facing us, the limits to what the ocean can produce and can support, and that some of that is growing into nasty stuff, and a siloed single sector, single taxa, isolated, non-integrated approach, in other words, largely business as usual, will miss many opportunities and exacerbate these challenges. But there are also some common solutions to these challenges, and let's focus on that. There are some challenges noted in these prophecies where action now can make a difference, and that gives me hope. A lot of the possible solutions involve doubling down on forecasts and our predictive capabilities. These technical solutions are things we can enact now, and we know how to enact. They additionally, many of them involved reappropriating or revisiting, I should say, governance structures to better ensure that they can even address, let alone handle, the challenges raised here. We can also begin to incorporate the science of decision-making in all of our decision-making protocols much more rigorously. And I think we can recognize and leverage the value of trade-offs. Maybe it would be wise to stop arguing amongst ourselves over 4 significant decimal point false precision challenges and missing the bigger pictures. And I think we can do a lot more scenario planning and strategy evaluation than we currently do. So that's a list of solutions. A lot of you are probably coming up with your own. That's fantastic. Beyond these technical solutions, though, there were a couple adaptive solutions that kept emerging. And nearly all of these challenges suggest the need to simply recognize and admit that a prediction or prophecy or problem is happening or likely to happen, thus emphasizing that we need to better communicate maintainable urgency that is not burning people out with constant crisis, but highlighting the importance of the issue with both long-term consequences and long-term solutions by focusing on these actionable solutions and keeping that in the forefront of people's awareness, I think will benefit us. The other adaptive solution that kept emerging was adopting a more integrated view and approach to the science we need to do. And in many ways, that's interdisciplinary. Note how many solutions that I flagged here were interdisciplinary and relied on social sciences. And I mean, I'm an ecologist saying that. So that really puts the human dimension research at the forefront of what we do. It also calls that we be even more organizationally flexible, less siloed, less program-oriented, and perhaps more outcome-focused. By formally adopting ecosystem-based management as the way we do business, I think we can make progress on a lot of all of this. Now, this is not to say that we're not doing a lot of this already and we don't work well together, but I think there's much more we can and need to do. Again, certainly there are other solutions, and I trust you are activated enough to keep working on them and finding them and implementing them, which leads to my final prophecy. I posed some key questions here to get us thinking about how we might address some of these ocean prophecies. What do we need to stop doing? What do we need to do differently? What do we need to start doing? Those are important things to ponder. So recall that prophetic versus status quo tension I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. I want to challenge us to ensure that we don't lose that, quote, prophetic role and that we continue to focus on these challenges facing us and the possible solutions to them. I think as scientists, sometimes we run the risk of losing this, quote, prophetic role by perpetuating the status quo and pushing for projects, programs, budget, turf, whatever, and instead of solutions and partnerships and outcomes that we would like to see. I know that sounds naive, maybe even Pollyanna-ish, but while we still need to focus on the specific each of our mission areas, we need to expand our thinking to realize that one area impacts another. And we need to be more integrative in how we approach these forthcoming challenges. Which leads to my final prophecy. That prediction is that we will rise to the challenge and find solutions to these other predictions. And the probability of occurring in the next 10 to 20 years is, I don't know. And the reason I say that is I first wanted to say this prediction was 100%, because we kind of have to address these issues and we kind of ought to work together. And I could be all optimistic and just assert that it will be 100%. And I really do want to be positive. But if overdone, I think I'd sound like a Disney movie or a Hallmark show or something like that. Then I thought this prediction might only be 50-50, and 100% might not be realistic nor reasonable given our expectations for one another and ourselves. I know that we as an organization, all of us face challenges, and I don't want to downplay all the hurdles facing us. Thus, perhaps even odds was a prediction. But then I thought, this prediction is really up to all of us and each of you. That is, addressing the challenges I've flagged today depends on us, and whether we collectively, as NOAA, as our scientific and management communities, as our partners and teams, and really for all of our disciplines, will be able to tackle these challenges. I think the answer to that really depends on the choices we make, the priorities we emphasize, and the issues we focus on. Thus, I want to challenge all of us with a call to action, if you will, to move beyond just the science that we support and do, but to better integrate it with one another, to better communicate it to the public that needs to hear it, and perhaps move away from what we're comfortable doing into new areas to develop novel solutions to these challenges. So I want to be realistic, but hopeful, because we have to address these challenges. We don't have a choice. We can't not solve the challenges I raised today. So we are all problem solvers. We're all solution providers and fellow, quote, prophets who can see what needs to be done. So please join me as we work to tackle these amazingly difficult but critical challenges facing us in the coming years. So again, let me show you my final takeaway thoughts. And by the way, that is a picture of me. And I thank you again for your time. Back to you, Tracy. Thank you.
Wow, Jason, thanks for a really inspiring, powerful talk. That was just wonderful. And we do have many questions. So we're going to put Jason up on webcam along with Will Claybor, who's going to be moderating the questions. Okay, great. Take it away, guys.
Thanks, Tracy. And thank you all audience members who are submitting questions. Please continue to do so. And we'll go to about 3:20 as long as the questions keep rolling in. So Jason, the first question comes from Emily, who says that they've been working at the Science, Policy, and Society interface for many years, and that the biggest challenge that they've found is that scientists say it's not their job to provide advice on action and tend to contradict simplified indicators or recommendations because they're too simple or that they cannot say for sure that X and Y is caused by Z. Emily thinks that we need to push scientists beyond the comfort level that their job is to publish peer-reviewed publications and take ownership that they are the experts on action. What are your thoughts on this?
Emily, I can see both sides to that. I probably would lean towards you. I understand the concerns and the cautions inherent in a lot of scientists. I understand the need to understand mechanism and detail and process. I get that. I understand that. I really do. And that there's a standard of science that perhaps the general public doesn't always appreciate. You know, that said, we do need to take action and move forward. And I would argue, and I think, you know, perhaps I oversimplified today, but we do know enough to act in a lot of these instances. We probably are not going to have a mechanistic understanding of every taxa, of every process in every ecosystem, and we probably can't wait for that. And I understand the desire for that knowledge, but we're seeing signals that are big enough, macro enough, and large enough that we probably need to act. And that's why I was pushing pretty hard for scenario planning, management strategy evaluations, et cetera, that bracket that within the context of uncertainty. Certainly there's many analytical methods to do that, that can explore those types of uncertainty and look at which potential solutions can be helpful. And again, within NOAA, we are a mission-driven, mandate-driven organization, so we have to pay attention to that. So thanks for the question, Emily. Appreciate it.
Eric would like to know where you got your probabilities for the predictions and prophecies.
So there are many bits of literature I read in preparation for this. A lot of those came there. The IPC also had the hydrosphere and cryosphere report. I can get the specific name and we can post it somewhere. But a lot of those types of documents lay things out. I like the IPCC style of highly probable, not very probable, and then they scale that to a scale of 1 to 10. But those were some of the places where those bits of information came from.
Great. Switgard would like to know, how can we better make use of our young people and their high educational background to help with these challenges? There's a problem that our youth feel not needed in our world. How do we connect them with these issues and empower them to help us make change?
Can you repeat the name again, Will?
It comes from Switgard.
Switgard. Okay. Well, I would argue we absolutely need you. You all are going to be the ones, the young people are going to be huge in actually implementing and acting out these solutions and finding out what they look like. In many ways, this type of talk is geared for folks just at your age. And certainly it's generally applicable, but we do want to enact, activate, excite, and bring in people to our organization all across NOAA and into the disciplines that we've talked about in general. We need that next body of, that next wave of scientists. And Will is a great example as a Canals Fellow, but there are many others that we can do. We need all hands on deck to address these challenges. So.
Les says that on a separate topic, there's much science that hasn't been brought into practice but should be. Of course, I'm thinking topmost of our work on chaos and system dynamics, but so much else. Can you comment on supportive science and things of that?
So, Les, if you're talking chaos dynamics and system dynamics and those kinds of sciences, a lot of my thinking actually comes from those fields of study. I spent about 2 years, about 3 or 4 years ago, digging into some of that, and particularly systems thinking. That type of science to support this and all the issues we've talked about really laid out different ways and approaches. And the systematic approach of looking at things led me into discovering yet again, but even with an emphasis, things like portfolio analyses, things like some of the other elements that I mentioned here. And I think there is a role for those in different ways of approaching some of the science or bringing different disciplines in that can really help us out.
Peter thinks it may be hard to find solutions to climate-driven shifts on decadal timescales, given the inertia on climate change, and wants to know what you mean by solution.
Yeah, that's great. Good question, Peter. So by solutions, I mean from the human perspective and how we interact with the ecosystems. Some of these we're probably not going to mitigate. In other words, we're not going to be able to stop. What the solutions then would be is how do we adapt to them, knowing what's coming? What are the things we can do to plan, to reorganize, to restructure, to revise how we do business in all of our daily lives in the coastal areas that we are responsible for? So by solutions, there are some instances where we can mitigate and stop and reverse damage. In others, we might not be able to stop the trends, at the global scale, but we can certainly adapt to them. And we want to make sure that we're getting those in place before it's too late to act even for that.
There are a couple questions about the difficulty of making humans change their behaviors and sort of expressing pessimism related to some of the solutions that you posed. Could you provide some reasons for audience members to be optimistic as far as finding solutions?
Yeah, I'm sorry if this was a downer for everybody and a bummer. That's not the intent. The intent was to perhaps maybe wake us up so that we could do exactly what we just did in the last question, begin to do the adaptation and build in resilience. The reasons I'm optimistic and why I would pose other people for leaning towards that is we've always been an adaptive species. We've always been a very intelligent set of people in a scientific community. We've always risen to the challenge. I think that we can continue to build upon that, and we need to continue to build upon that. The other bit that I see in terms of the human behavior and adaptation thereof, and there's a lot of emerging fields of study, and I'm not talking, bread and butter psychology, certainly that's part of it, but there are other fields of study that are beginning to explore how you can do this, how you can deal with cognitive biases in the context of application for some of the things we talked about. There's a lot of ongoing work and emerging work right now. So I'm hopeful that a lot of that is there. The last thing that I'm optimistic about is before all my beard was gray and I started and I looked more like Will with hair on the top of my head, we would often have teams of scientists, 2 or 3 folks, and it was all about our topic area. Now we have teams. They're usually a lot larger, but almost inevitably they're multidisciplinary. And that to me means that we're getting it and we're making headway on that. And we're bringing those multiple perspectives to the table. So that's some of the sets of reasons why I do think we can find solutions.
There were a couple more specific questions asking about definitions for some of the terms like portfolio management of fisheries, ecosystem-based fishery management, and then some additional questions about what it might take to implement some of these things as far as integrating state and federal management practices.
Sure, Will, thanks, and thank you all for those questions. There are formal portfolio analyses that deal with, and I won't get into the math of it, but the covariance across different state variables or different stocks in a stock market or financial context. That's kind of what we're talking about, but you apply that then to fisheries. If you email Will or I, we can get you on detailed references and provide that. In terms of ecosystem-based fishery management, NOAA Fisheries has several documents and a policy statement and a roadmap, and there's been several syntheses of that, and we can similarly email you that. And also NOAA at the same level has similar things on ecosystem-based management, and there's several documents that kind of lay out all those distinctions and others that, EBM by different names. There's a lot of work on that. So without getting into the details here too much, we can certainly point people to where those documents are. I would say if you need a simple definition, it's how do you catch fish? How do you protect certain critters? How do you
Sorry, I can't hear you, Jason. Jason's frozen for a second. Okay, Jason will be back in just a second.
Yeah, it appears as though we lost Jason.
We'll log back in. I'll text him. Hi, folks online. We're getting a lot of good questions, and Will's going ahead and sorting them and organizing them together, or grouping like questions. So we still have time for a few more questions.
Can you all hear me?
Okay. Yeah, now we can.
Okay, sorry. Screen went blank.
We lost you.
Sorry about that.
We lost you for a minute.
That's too bad. It was such a brilliant answer.
No problem. How about the next question?
Sure.
Sure. Scott wants to know if there's any disciplines that NOAA needs to
Great
hire more
question.
of.
And without alienating anybody, we need to sit down and look at that. I'm not going to answer that in the simple, straightforward manner. I would rather flag it as maybe we need to think about teams of disciplines to address, you know, composite issues and challenges in given ecosystems. And that's why I'm not answering it, across the board, across NOAA, because some regions or some issues may have different levels of need than others. But I think a look like that would be certainly worthwhile.
Elrond wants to know, scientists are important knowledge providers for society in general, and it's up to the politicians to act upon advices given to them by scientists. However, it has been reported over the years that there's an increase in mixing of both science and activism at these scales.
Yep.
How do you suppose we deal
Understand the
with that?
challenge. I think there are protocols in place on the scientific side to vet and verify and validate the science that we provide. And, we can get into the details of that, but there's enough process and protocol in most of the disciplines and situations I mentioned. Full stop. As scientists, we're also subject matter experts. And I think we need to be very clear when we're providing an informed opinion as an expert on a topic. And I think we have a place to do that versus an opinion on a topic outside of our area of expertise. And we, are very much in place doing that and need to be cognizant of that. And that balance is sometimes difficult, but that's, protocols and then recognizing area of expertise. We're pretty good at self-limiting. But the bigger issue is within our systems, within the challenges we're facing. If people ask, we're raising awareness, doing interviews, talking to the public, whatever. That is often what people think of with respect to activism. And as long as it's scientifically vetted and validated, and you can back it up, and as long as you're clear that this is an expert opinion versus not, this is just my opinion on whether the Red Sox will win another World Series or not. I'm not expert enough to predict that, but those kind of things I think are ways we can manage that balance.
Brian wants to know, many of the prophecies, certainly the first three, plus some of the others that you mentioned, are
Good question.
international
I think
issues.
the first thing is simply awareness and simply recognition that we do live in a global, multilateral, international world now. What we do in one place affects other parts of the world. And that's with respect to many potential aspects of some of the things we talked about. I think that general awareness is the first thing. I think NOAA actually, people might be surprised to realize how much we interface and interact with partners all around the world on a lot of different topics. And I think there's opportunities there to engage with our international colleagues and partners. And that affords an opportunity to perhaps interact there. And then we also have interagency, other U.S. government, other organizations, opportunities to discuss and interact with them in some of these topics. So there are opportunities, and certainly we can keep those in mind.
Mackenzie would like to know
Tony
if you think.
Marshak and I wrote a paper on that, and there's just different underlying conditions, different underlying considerations, long sets of history. We looked at different 90 variables. There's no one right or real or clear answer, Mackenzie. It just, in each region, there's just a set of conditions that make it more amenable or not for a variety of factors. I can get into the specifics, but it really is the local cultures, local histories and backgrounds, as well as data sets and players and people involved over time that have probably been a big part of that. Okay.
All right, we'll do two more. Carrie wants to know, As a science-based agency, we tend to focus on the problems and the dire predictions of what might happen due to these problems. And Carrie thinks that this isn't necessarily motivating. How can we
I
change?
hope that's one of the takeaways is there are solutions and we can emphasize them. And it gets to some of the scenario planning and the strategy evaluations and the forecasts and the decision making under uncertainty. There's a whole range of science that we can and need to do that really points to what the solutions could be and gets people to activate on those to those ends. Yes, it is.
I'm going to
Long
add
story.
one more quick one in before
Thanks,
we get to
Jim.
the last question. Jim would like to know if that's a bear over your shoulder. Emily says that they're in on much of what you're saying, but they're really concerned about leaving behind some of the communities that'll be most impacted by the challenges outlined, and they might not necessarily be
I
communities
turn
or
that
groups of
around to
people.
Emily. How do you help us make sure we don't forget them? And I would also flag, you know, a lot of what I was emphasizing was social sciences and communication and outreach, and we have a lot of people doing that. There's probably more than perhaps we're aware of. I think trying to ensure that we don't lose that and we perhaps build on some of those efforts. I could walk around the country and point to specific instance after specific instance, but bolstering that and making sure we continue to do that is a key thing. And then if there's solutions or particular groups or particular geographies we're missing, let's raise awareness of that and see what we can do to help them get in on some of these solutions as well.
I'm going to add one more in before we wrap up. There were a couple questions about aquaculture and whether or not you think aquaculture could play a role in being a solution to some of the
I
prophecies
do,
that you
Robert.
mentioned.
That's another talk. We won't get into it today. Certainly, there's a place for aquaculture, but I think we need to manage expectations on what we can reasonably expect aquaculture to provide and do. Definitely, there's a role. What that looks like, how that plays out, whole other set of. No, thank you, Will, and I want to thank the audience for sticking in here to the very end, and thank you all for your attention. I really appreciate you all listening, and hopefully, again, the solutions that we all collectively develop will begin to emerge and continue to emerge from our collective efforts. So thank you all.
Great. Thank you, Jason. That was a terrific talk, very inspiring. And thanks also to Will Claybore for moderating the Q&A. And thanks to the NELS team and the captioner for making this webinar possible. The link to the recording and PDF of the slides will be archived at the NOAA Central Library link listed in the Q&A box. When you leave the meeting today, a web page will open to NOAA EcoWatch, which Jason mentioned earlier in his talk. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Bye-bye.